Okay, this video has been this video right here. A few people have been waiting for it. Um, Now dictatorships are not efficient. Basically, they've been most of the times dictatorships end in failure, or the dictator ends up being killed. Now see how Putin and Xi have wrecked their countries, and now perhaps the most surprising story of the past year has been the abysmal performance of the Russian military in its invasion of invading Ukraine. Its clumsy tactics, military trucks with dry rotted tires, rations, and medicines that had expired decades ago, and troops are making targets of themselves by talking on cell phones, and even the use of raw conscripts as human ways to detect Ukrainian positions in lieu of conducting proper reconnaissance. It has been nothing. It has been nothing but incompetence from a nation which most observers, including many military experts, had believed would roll over Ukraine in a couple of weeks, and that's turned out to be the exact opposite. Now consider China, a country that many Americans appear to think is almost diabolically efficient. As the COVID pandemic began to spread in early 2020, it quickly became evident that sensible social distancing measures were in order and calibrated to a level that most reasonable people would tolerate without being overly disruptive to the everyday social life. Now, when highly effective Mirna vaccines became available in early 2021, it was imperative that we had to administer them as widely as possible. Instead, Beijing ordered a draconian lockdown that caused our GDP growth to drop by more than 3%. Even as it refused to obtain as basically they refused to obtain our Western vaccines. Basically, the apparent result is that inhabitants of the most populous country in the world have little immunity from prior exposure, and while their government has refused a formal offer from the U.S. to provide vaccines that are effective, as a result, we can expect new waves of mutated COVID strains emanating from China as a direct consequence of its rulers' obstinacy. Now, let's take a look at the president of Turkey. Under the presidency of Recep Erdogan, Turkey has moved inexorably away from democracy to a one-man rule and a punitive crackdown on dissidents. Now that an earthquake has struck that country, the capability of Erdogan's government to expedite the rescue and recovery is under the microscope. It's not encouraging. It's not an encouraging look, basically. Erdogan's years-long campaign against foreign NGOs means that there's far less domestic infrastructure to perform disaster relief. Now, amid the rubble, Turkey's ruler has already preemptively threatened potential critics. As one observer had put it, he's warning journalists and civil society that we will prosecute you if you criticize us. He's trying to short-circuit any discussion about accountability. Now, what do Russia, China, and Turkey have in common, beyond their incompetence in critical situations, is that they are authoritarian. The link between authoritarianism and habitual blundering ought to be obvious, but yet a surprising number of people claim to admire dictatorships because they believe that it's efficient compared to the slow, messy, and contentious work of paramilitary democracy. Along with the illusion that tax cuts increase revenue, the notion that authoritarian regimes are clear-sighted, clever, and efficient is one of the more persistent canards in political pathology. Even our Even our xenophobes fall prey to this delusion, in the sense that building that country up into an eminent and existential threat paradoxically gives us the Chinese system more credit than it deserves. The hysterical panic mongering of Republican politicians regarding the Chinese spy balloon that was duly parodied by the mainstream media was not merely widely disproportionate and dismissive of the U.S. capacity to to gain valuable intelligence from it, but the criticism was also an implicit attack on weak democracies for the alleged inability to protect the people, meaning the faux viewers, and from the paranoid fears that Republicans have labored so hard to instill in them. The United States is as prone to the tug of authoritarian worship as anywhere else. Let's review Trump's administration. The high-handedness tempered by incompetence and ending in a failed Klan attack makes painfully evident, and the admiration for dictatorships among citizens of freer countries has a long and undistinguished pedigree. Probably the first great object of this dictator worship in the modern era is Benito Mussolini. It was Mussolini of whom it was said that he made the trains run on time, and for a while he had quite a big following among the rich and influential people. Another one, Thomas W. Lamont, a J.P. Morgan and co-partner, was one of the most influential bankers of the early 20th century. A sign of his power was that he accompanied Woodrow Wilson to Germany to negotiate reparations for them, as opposed to assigning it to some mere lackey like the Secretary of State. and a few years later, he became quite the Mussolini admirer, saying that he had become something of a missionary for fascism, and calling him a very upstanding chap, which was anything but that. And Lamont was not alone in his thinking. Politicians and businessmen all over America and Europe had heaped praise on Mussolini. In 1927, in one of Winston Churchill's less than finest hours, he said of the Italian dictator, "If I had been an Italian, I'm sure that I should have been wholeheartedly with you from the start to finish in your triumphant struggle against the appetites and passions of Leninism." But how efficient was Benito Mussolini's regime? Paul Corner, a noted scholar of the subject, says that economic progress under fascism was largely propaganda. There were a few showy projects and some hideous moments in Rome, but Italy built fewer houses between the wars than France or Great Britain did, and countries presumed to be mired in depression. By the late 1930s, there was a de facto food rationing. All of that could be rationed, however, as necessary sacrifice for the martial glories to come. Now, Mussolini never tired of speaking of war as the most sublime expression of the human spirit. War alone brings up to their highest tension that all human energies, and it imposes the stamp of nobility upon the people who have the courage to make this. This mystical belief in military power and its triumphant exertion in war holds a peculiar fascination for authoritarian leadership. Despite almost 2 decades of supposed preparation, the Italian military was woefully under-equipped in 1940. They were short on artillery. Its tanks were deficient in every respect, and it was incompetently led by strutting martinets. Its navy, intended to secure the Mediterranean as Mare Nostrum, meaning our sea, and eventually lay at the bottom of that sea. Mussolini himself ended up being lynched alongside his mistress at a Milan patrol station by his own countrymen, hardly the Byronic man of destiny's heroic death in battle. Now, Corner believes that post-war Italy never had a proper reckoning with its fascist past, preferring to forget about the war, and rationalize Mussolini as not as bad as Hitler, which is a rather low bar, and misremember the pre-war times as preposterous. The Mussolini kitsch has long been for sale in Italian shops, and the removal of his fortune from a government ministry resulted predictably in the Italian right wing declaring Mussolini a victim of cancel culture, which is anything but that. Italy's new government, whose prime minister Giorgia Meloni leads a right-wing party that traces its origins to Mussolini's National Fascist Party, and it suggests that the dictator nostalgia is alive and well. Now, Adolf Hitler is the standard that some Italians use to determine a bad dictator, but that has not prevented him from gaining the flock of foreign admirers both in his lifetime and even long after his death. Everyone from the Duke and Duchess of Windsor to Charles Lindbergh to Henry Ford were ardent followers of Hitler. Nazi parties like the German-American Bund sprang up in many countries. Almost 8 decades later, he still has a fan club, as the Camp Auschwitz t-shirt wearers and the Hitler impersonators among the January 6 Klan writers suggest. Kanye West had lately proclaimed himself a devotee of the late dictator, a somewhat incongruous viewpoint in light of Nazi racial policies. Now, while more efficient than its Axis member to the south, Nazi Germany was hardly a consumer paradise. Adam Tooze, the definitive chronicler of the Nazi economy, points out that, like Italy, Germany already had de facto food rationing 2 years before the war started, and workers had jobs at the price of a low wage, long hours, and a prohibition against quitting in many industries. Labor unions had long since been smashed. Basically, by 1938, the coffee was mostly ersatz, and gasoline was increasingly scarce. And despite Albert Speer's ostentatious public buildings, residential construction lagged. Everything was being siphoned off into armaments. Now, Germany's military was more effective than Italy's, but that advantage was more than nullified by the dictatorship's horrible judgment. The blunders Germany committed are too numerous to list. Suffice it to say that levying war against the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States simultaneously did not prove to be an exercise in strategic wisdom. Now, even after Pearl Harbor was bombed by Japan, the American entry into war against Germany was not guaranteed, but such was the isolationist sentiment and the desire to concentrate solely on Japan. Hitler sealed the deal when 4 days after Pearl Harbor was bombed, he nonchalantly declared war against the greatest industrial power on earth, while his army was buried in snowdrifts before Moscow and suffering from more than 130,000 frostbites. As Napoleon had discovered more than a century earlier, it's generally a bad idea to campaign in Russia without winter gear. Now, the Democrats alone are also not immune from a dictator syndrome. Now, look at George Orwell, a man who was a Democrat himself, and he was revolted by the servile manner in which many Western intellectuals had fawned over Joseph Stalin, one of the most disgusting murderers in history. The monstrous crimes like the Ukrainian famine were either denied outright by Stalin's fans, or they replied to with the truism that you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. Given Russia's miserable standard of living, one wonders where the omelet is. Stalin's reading section lauded his cynical deal with Hitler to divide up a prostrate Poland as a diplomatic masterstroke, when in reality it's merely set the stage for Hitler's eventual invasion of the Soviet Union itself. One person can see much the same spectacle among some Western students in the 1960s who waved around copies of Mao Zedong's Little Red Book, and it appears to have escaped their attention that the Great Cultural Revolution was still going on in the country that they idolized, resulting in roughly 1.5 million people dead from government-inspired violence. Now, as for the regime's efficiency, the Great Leap Forward, which was from 1959 to 61, is unquestionably the most disastrous industrialization policy in history. This scheme was to force virtually the entire country to smelt pig iron in the backyards that left crops unattended. The catastrophic outcome was anywhere from 20 million to 43 million people dead, and estimates have such a wide range because Beijing has suppressed the statistics, and even now it forbids people to mention any open discussion of the subject in that country. And while there's still the temptation to admire dictatorships by citizens in relatively freer and better run countries, and for some element at the top layer of society, the attraction is straightforward and material. Dictatorships, or at least those of the right, are the best guarantee against pesky unions and people who demand a living wage or adequate and affordable health care. Plutocrats will not only preserve their wealth from progressive taxation, but an authoritarian regime will in almost every case enhance their wealth, possibly the only thing such as a regime is efficient at doing. But what of the rest of society? The arms manufacturer Alfred Krupp might have made out like a bandit, but how do we explain the ordinary Germans who had thronged the streets to cheer on Hitler? And for that matter, what did the pathetic, scruffy slobs who stormed the U.S. Capitol get out of it, other than prison sentences, social ostracization, and probable unemployability for the foreseeable future? Well, they can't. Well, technically, because the Trump sycophants don't have jobs, it'd be kind of hard for them to have unemployability when they don't work anyway. The complexities and frustrations of exercising responsibility of the responsible citizenship seems to exceed the ability or patience of some people. And to be sure, the wrangling of parties, the broken campaign promises, and the sheer unwillingness of it all can turn people off. And having worked in Congress, even I haven't, but Michael Lofgren did. He said that it was strictly an unedifying spectacle, and that was before the current crop of lunatics with election certificates descended on the premises. It is tempting to cut through the Gordian descendant on the premises, basically, and the knot of checks and balances and the inconvenient thing that we call the rule of law by putting someone in charge to give orders and knock heads. But we must not underestimate a strain of basically machoism in some people, the desire to bow down to the mighty as if they were prostrating themselves before a deity. This pathology was frequently on display during Trump Klan rallies, creating scenes comparable to only the gyrations and speaking in tongues one might witness in the rituals of obscure Christian sects. Inevitably, there arose from the right-wing fever swamps a cottage industry, churning out schlock paintings of Trump as a heroic figure who's anything but that, who has miraculously shed 60 pounds, which he hasn't, and displays implausible masculinity, which he doesn't. These efforts make Tijuana portraits of Elvis look like Rembrandt masterpieces, but they also reveal the Freudian subconscious of Trump worship to an embarrassing fucking degree. Such fucking failed attempts at art also echo earlier artistic idealizations of authoritarian leaders. Sorry about that. There must be a deeper cause of this syndrome than mere dissatisfaction with present politics. Given that the abundant historical evidence that authoritarian systems are worse run, more corrupt and invariably contemptuous of human life, and perhaps some early childhood disturbance in interactions with authority figures like parents is the ultimate factor of this. And back in 1954, political scientist Richard Hofstadter may have put his finger on it when he described such a person as having a disorder in relation to authority, characterized by an inability to find other modes for human relationship than those of more or less complete domination or submission. The excuse of efficiency is a feeble rationale, and what appears instead to motivate popular attraction to authoritarianism systems is what psychoanalyst Eric Fromm had called the irrational drive from escape from freedom. It is increasingly obvious that serious clinical study of the mental pathology leads to an enthusiastic rejection of one's own freedom, and autonomy is as urgent as cancer research. So, basically, authoritarian dictatorships don't really go too well. So basically, they're a failure, and basically, the Republicans won a dictatorship over basically democracy, and that's going to be a failure for them. So, so they can want a dictatorship all we want. Now the Democrats have to step up and say, fuck you, we're not going to want a dictatorship, we're going to want democracy, and we're going to have to show them that at the voting booth in 2024. So basically, if you like the video, you can give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King. You can also hit the notification bell, so you'll be notified when the new video comes out. You can leave a comment, let me know what you think. And also, if you want to support my work even further, you can donate to my Patreon link, which you can find in the About section of YouTube. And for just as little as a few bucks a month, or even for a video, your donation can help go a long way, and thanks for listening.